The crossroads station floated between three star systems like a coin someone had dropped and never bothered to pick up. It was not beautiful. It was not impressive. It was simply there, turning slowly in. The dark, full of creatures who wanted things from each other and were too proud to ask nicely. Ambassador Claire Donovan had lived on it for 11 years, and she still found it strange every single morning. She was a thin woman with gray-brown hair and the kind of face that made people think she was listening even when she was not. She came from a small town in Ohio on a planet called Earth, which most of the council species had difficulty finding on a map. This did not bother Claire. In fact, she had come to believe it was one of the most useful things about her. Earth had been a member of the Galactic Accord for 63 years. Humans had arrived cautious, spoke little, and settled into the outer ring of the council chamber like guests at a party who were not sure they had been invited. Over the decades, the other species had formed an opinion of them. The opinion was not cruel. It was something worse. It was gentle. The Valeri, who had run the council for 2 centuries, considered humans to be well-meaning and a little slow. The Greel thought they were harmless. The Dorith, who did not think about anything they could not sell, barely thought about them at all. Claire had heard all of these opinions, in one form or another, over her years on the station. She never argued with any of them. She simply filed them away the way she filed everything in a part of her mind that was very organized and very patient. On this particular morning, she was sitting in the council observation bay, drinking something the station called coffee, which tasted nothing like coffee, but was warm and dark and did the job. Outside the wide viewport, a Valeri battle cruiser was drifting past on its way to the inner lanes. It was an enormous ship, gray and angular, with weapon systems that could crack open a moon. Claire watched it pass and did not look away until it was gone. Then she went to the council chamber. The chamber was a wide, circular room, with tiered seating arranged around a central speaking floor. Each of the 14 member species had a designated section. The human section was in the outer ring, near the back. It had 3 seats. Claire sat in the center one. On her left was Grant Pelham, who was the human naval liaison on the station. On her right was Nadia Ortiz, who was officially listed as a scientific observer and unofficially was the sharpest person Claire had ever met. Grant was a lean man in his mid-40s with short dark hair and a habit of reading wherever he went. He had a book in his hand even now, setting it face down on the arm of his chair as the session opened. He had been on the crossroads for 11 years, same as Claire. In all that time, he had asked perhaps a dozen questions in open council. He was there to listen, and he was very good at it. Nadia was younger, early 30s, with dark eyes that moved constantly around a room cataloging things. She had a degree in xenobiology and another in behavioral science, and she could tell you what a Valeri was feeling by the angle of its secondary spine. Before the Valeri knew itself, she sat with a small notepad on her knee and wrote in it without looking down. The session that morning was about shipping lane fees. It was one of the least interesting topics the Accord managed, and it came up roughly every 8 months. Elder Soreth, the Valeri Council chair, moved through the agenda with the practiced ease of someone who had been running these meetings for 40 years. He was tall with a crystalline structure along his shoulders that caught the light when he moved, and he spoke in a low, even voice that made everything sound already decided. Claire voted in line with the Valari block on all 3 items. She always did. It was not because she agreed with everything. It was because the items she cared about were never on the public agenda. After the session, Sorath found her in the corridor outside. This happened sometimes. He liked Claire in the way a person likes a familiar object in their home. Comfortable, expected, not particularly surprising. He asked her how Earth was managing the new fuel tax. She told him with a small smile that they were managing fine. He nodded and said he was glad, and that humanity was always such a reliable partner in the accord. Claire thanked him. She watched him walk away, his crystalline shoulders catching the corridor lights. On the other side of the station, in a small office that no one visited, a young Valari clerk named Fessin was doing something very boring. He had been assigned to archive duty for 3 months, which was a punishment for filing a report in the wrong format twice in a row. His job was to go through 60 years of human resource submissions and make sure they had been entered correctly into the new record system. It was the kind of work that made a person feel like time had stopped. But somewhere in the 4th week, Fessin noticed something. He did not notice it all at once. It crept up on him slowly, the way pattern does when you have been staring at numbers long enough. Every human submission was on time. Not early. Not late. Exactly on time. And every human compliance score sat at exactly the minimum required by accord law. Not 1 point above it. Not ever. 63 years. Every category. Every year. Fessin sat with this for a while. Then he mentioned it to a colleague in the break room as something mildly amusing. The colleague laughed and said humans were probably just very boring. Fessin agreed. They finished their drinks and went back to work. Neither of them thought about it again. That evening, Claire sat alone in the observation bay. The shipping lanes were quiet. A slow cargo hauler was moving through the outer path, its lights blinking in the standard pattern. She watched it for a while the way she watched everything. She was thinking about something, but her face gave nothing away. It never did. She finished her drink, set the cup down carefully, and looked out at the dark between the stars. She smiled at nothing in particular. Then she went to bed. There is a kind of patience that most people cannot hold for very long. It is not the patience of waiting for a bus or waiting for a meal to cook. It is the patience of building something that will not be finished in your lifetime, and trusting that the person who comes after you will understand why it matters. Humans had been practicing this kind of patience for 63 years, and almost no one outside of Earth knew it. Grant Pelham knew it. He had known it since the day he arrived on the crossroads station, when his commanding officer shook his hand, handed him a small encrypted drive, and said, "Read it, remember it, then wipe it." Grant had done all 3. What was on that drive was not a plan so much as a way of thinking. It had no author listed. It had probably been written by 20 different people over 40 years, each one adding a paragraph and passing it on, like a letter that was never meant to arrive, only to travel The core idea was simple: do not move until you are ready, and do not let anyone know how close to ready you are. While the Accord held its sessions and filed its reports and argued about shipping lane fees, humans had been building, not loudly, not quickly, and not in any place that the Accord thought to look. The first thing they built was a communication network. It had taken 40 years and the work of several hundred engineers, most of whom died before it was finished. They called it the Carver Network after Eleanor Carver, who had designed the first relay node in a small workshop on the edge of the asteroid belt near Saturn. She had been 41 when she started. She did not live to see the second node completed. Her daughter finished it. The Carver Network could move a message across 3 star systems in under 8 seconds. The Accord's relay system took 14 minutes. No one on the Crossroads station knew the Carver Network existed. It used frequencies that the Accord had never bothered to monitor, tucked between bands that everyone had agreed were too noisy to be useful. Humans had learned to use the noise. The second thing they built was the anchor yards, 17 shipyards, each one hidden inside an asteroid belt or parked behind a dead moon. They did not appear on any Accord registry. They had been built piece by piece. Components moved on cargo haulers whose manifests listed them as mining equipment or scientific supplies, which was technically not a lie since some of the equipment was used for mining and some of the supplies were used for science. The yards had been operational for between 8 and 22 years. In that time, they had produced more than 400 vessels of various sizes, all of them sitting cold and dark in distributed positions throughout the outer rim, running on minimal power. Waiting. Admiral Lena Cross, who was now 78 and living quietly in New Mexico, had overseen the construction of 9 of those yards. She had never spoken publicly about any of it. A historian named Patrick Wade found her through a mutual contact and sat with her for 3 afternoons in her kitchen, asking careful questions. She answered most of them. She told Wade that the strategy had not come from any single decision. No president had ordered it. No general had designed it. It had grown from something older than that, a collective understanding that had passed through generations of human leadership the way a language passes through generations of a family. You do not decide to speak your grandmother's language. You simply grow up inside it. Every person in a position of real authority on Earth's diplomatic and military corps was briefed on what she called the long plan. The briefing was never written in any document that could be accessed by outside systems. It was given in person by someone who had received it the same way, and it ended the same way every time. You do not have to believe this will work. You only have to keep building. Claire Donovan had received her briefing from Ambassador Harold Pike, who had been her predecessor and her mentor. He had taken her to a small office on the station during her first week, closed the door, and talked for 2 hours. She remembered that his hands were very still while he spoke, which was unusual for him. He had died 4 years after she arrived, quietly in a hospital bed in Cleveland. She had cried for a day and then gone back to the council chamber and voted in line with the Valerie bloc. Nadia Ortiz had received her briefing from a professor of alien ecology named Dr. Leon Marsh, who had spent 40 years on the crossroads pretending to study fungal growth patterns on the station. His real work, the work that mattered, was a behavioral database of every species in the accord. 40 years of observations recorded in a format that looked, to any outside scan, like raw biological data. Nadia had inherited the database when he retired. She had been adding to it ever since. There was one person who had almost broken the silence. His name was Colonel Damon Vance, and in the year 2074, he had submitted a formal proposal to the Human Diplomatic Committee suggesting that Earth reveal the anchor yards to the Accord as a gesture of goodwill. His argument was reasonable. He believed that trust had to be built at some point, and that hiding what they had built was becoming kind of dishonesty that made him uncomfortable. He was not a coward, and he was not naive. He simply believed that the waiting was finished. The committee shelved his proposal without comment. He was reassigned to a research posting in the outer colonies. He spent the rest of his career there, doing good work that no one paid attention to, and he carried his discomfort with him like something he could not put down. He died in 2089. His daughter, Lieutenant Sarah Vance, was currently 26 years old and serving as a navigation officer on a ship called the Steady Hand, which was sitting cold and dark in an asteroid belt not far from the outer rim. She did not yet know that the waiting was almost over. None of them did except Claire. And Claire, as always, was not saying anything. The Dorith were not evil. That was what made them so difficult to deal with. Evil has a shape that people recognize. The Dorith were simply practical in the way that a machine is practical. They moved toward what they wanted and away from what cost them too much, and they did not think very deeply about what happened to anything that was in the way. What they wanted in this particular season was control of 3 shipping corridors in the outer rim. Those corridors connected a cluster of independent worlds to the supply networks that kept them alive. The independent worlds had no military to speak of. They had asked the Accord for help. Twice, both times politely, both times in writing. The Accord had responded with resolutions. The Dorith had ignored the resolutions. The supply ship stopped getting through. On the 3 worlds, the shortages began. The Accord Council discussed the matter for 6 weeks. This was not unusual. The Council was very good at discussing things. Elder Soroth laid out the situation with his usual calm, and the other delegates offered their thoughts, and various proposals were made and weighed and softened and amended until they became something that everyone could agree on and nothing could act on. The final resolution was strongly worded and passed by 12 votes to 2. The Dorith ignored it. They had also ignored the 4 resolutions before it. On the morning of the 7th week, Ambassador Claire Donovan asked to speak. She did this by placing a small marker on the table in front of her, which was the formal method. Soroth saw it, paused, and granted her the floor with a small open gesture of his upper hands, which in Valyrii body language was the equivalent of course, whenever you are ready. Claire stood up. She thanked the chair. She looked around the chamber the way she always did, slowly and without apparent urgency, and then she said that She would like to request formal authorization to address the situation in the Outer Rim corridors on behalf of the Accord. The chamber was quiet for a moment. Soroth asked her to clarify what she meant by address. She said she meant resolve. She asked for the authorization to be written, signed by all 14 member species, and delivered within 48 hours. She specified that she was not asking for additional resources. She said, everything she needed. There was a longer silence this time. Nadia, sitting 2 seats behind Claire, was watching the room. She noted the angle of Soroth's secondary spine, which had shifted a few degrees forward. She noted the way the Grial delegate turned its head to the side, which meant it was reassessing something. She wrote 3 words in her notebook. Without looking down, Soroth asked Claire what she planned to do. Claire said she would rather show them than explain it if the authorization could be provided. Soroth considered this. He had known Claire Donovan for 23 years. She had never asked for anything she did not intend to use, and she had never used anything carelessly. He did not know what she was planning. He found to his mild surprise that he trusted her anyway. He signed the authorization. The others followed, one by one, some quickly and some slowly, each for their own reasons. The Grial delegate signed last, after a pause that lasted long enough to make the room slightly uncomfortable. When the document was complete, Claire thanked the chamber, picked up her copy, and sat down. She did not smile. She did not look at Nadia. She folded her hands on the table and waited for the next agenda item. 6 hours later, in the small office near the back of the station's military liaison wing, Grant Pelham sat alone in front of a communication terminal. The room was quiet. The screen in front of him was open on a frequency that would not appear in any Accord log. He had a single message ready to send. It was 11 words long. He had been composing it in some form for 11 years. He sent it. It moved through the Carver network in under 8 seconds. Within the hour, it had reached all of them. On 17 cold, dark shipyards scattered across the Outer Rim, lights came on. Not all at once, not dramatically, but one section at a time, the way a house wakes up in the morning. Engineering teams who had been waiting on minimal rotation for months moved to their stations. Navigation officers pulled up charts they had been keeping ready for years. Commanders who had received the same briefing Grant had received passed down the same way through the same quiet chain, began making calls of their own. The Steady Hand, a mid-range vessel sitting in an asteroid belt 3 light towers from the contested corridors, powered up its main systems for the first time in 19 months. On the navigation deck, Lieutenant Sarah Vance ran the startup sequence she had run in drills dozens of times, and then looked up at the viewport where the stars were the same as they had always been. She thought about her father for a moment. Then she thought about her work on the other side of the station, in the observation bay. Nadia Ortiz was sitting in the chair where Claire usually Saturday, she was looking out at the shipping lanes. A Valerii merchant hauler was moving through the standard path, its running light slow and regular. Everything looked the same as it always did. Nadia knew that it would not look the same for much longer. She wrote one more word in her notebook. Then she waited. Commander Pete Harlow was not the kind of man who gave speeches. He was 44 years old, came from a small city in Georgia, and had spent 20 years in the human navy doing a kind of work that did not have a name on any official document. He had brown eyes and a calm voice, and a way of standing very still when things were moving fast around him, which was something his crew had come to find more reassuring than any speech would have been. He stood on the command deck of his ship, the Longview, and watched the formation assemble on the display in front of him. 42 vessels pulling out of cold positions across the outer rim, moving into the contested corridors with their running lights on and their weapon systems closed. Not hidden, not aggressive, just present the way a wall is present. It does not have to do anything. It simply has to be there. He gave the order to move. Within 4 hours, human ships had taken up positions at every key node in all 3 corridors. They did not block the lanes. They did not transmit any threatening signals. They deployed a series of communication arrays, small and efficient, which tied into the Carver network and gave them real-time awareness of everything moving in the area. Then they began escorting the supply convoys through. The first convoy to reach the Independent Worlds carried medicine, dried food, and water filtration parts. It arrived 14 hours ahead of the schedule its crew had thought was impossible. The Doroth noticed. A Doroth response fleet appeared at the edge of the corridor 4 hours after the first convoy got through. It was a larger fleet, heavier ships, the kind of formation that the Doroth sent when they wanted a conversation to end quickly. The fleet commander was a being named Vethora, who had a long career of making things simple by making them expensive. For the other side, Pete hailed the Doroth fleet on a standard channel. He introduced himself, gave his ship's name, and explained the situation. Plain terms. The 3 corridors were now under the temporary jurisdiction of the Galactic Accord, authorized in writing by all 14 member species. Any interference with Accord authorized shipping would be recorded and transmitted in real time to the full Council. The Accord's response would follow. There, Vethora asked what network Pete was using to transmit in real time. Pete told him it was a human communication system. Vethora said he had no record of any human communication system capable of real-time cross-system transmission. Pete said that was correct. He then offered a demonstration. He asked Vethora to compose a short message on the Doroth fleet channel. The message arrived on the Crossroads station and was acknowledged by the station's human liaison office in 6 seconds. The acknowledgement, which included the station's timestamp and Sarath's own council seal, appeared on Vethora's screen 11 seconds after he had finished composing the test message. Vethora sat with this for a while. He ordered his communications officer to locate the relay infrastructure responsible for the transmission. The communications officer spent 20 minutes looking. Then he told Vethora he could not find it. The Doroth fleet did not advance. It did not retreat. It held its position at the corridor edge for 6 hours, during which time 2 more supply convoys passed through without incident. Then Vethora filed a formal protest with the Accord Council and withdrew. On the Crossroads, Elder Sarath received an intelligence briefing that was unlike any he had received in 40 years of council work. Human ships had appeared at 14 locations in the outer rim simultaneously. The ships were of types not listed in any Accord registry. They were operating a communication network that moved faster than anything the Accord had built. They had resolved a 6-week diplomatic crisis in less than 36 hours and had not fired a single weapon. Sarath read the briefing twice. Then he asked his aide to compile every record of every interaction the Valari had ever had with Claire Donovan. His aide returned 3 hours later with a very large file. Sarath read it in 20 minutes. He put it down on his desk. He looked at the wall for a while. Then he said, quietly to the empty room, that he believed he had made a significant error in how he understood a particular situation. Nadia Ortiz was, at that moment, compiling her own report. She had been watching the stations, common areas, its corridors, its council anteroom, its observation decks all morning. She had been watching how the other species moved, how they held their bodies, how they talked to each other in small clusters and then went quiet when someone from the human delegation walked past. What she saw was not fear. It was not hostility. It was something more interesting than either. Every species on the station was doing the same thing at the same moment, going back through what they thought they knew and checking it against what had just happened, adjusting, recalibrating, the way you recalibrate a measurement tool when you discover the readings have been slightly off for years. She wrote her observations in plain language with no analysis added, because she did not think analysis was necessary. The facts were doing the work on their own. Grant Pelham ate his lunch alone in his office reading a book. The book was about the history of long-distance trade routes on Earth, which he had read 3 times before. His terminal showed incoming messages from the field, each one a short status report. He read each one, noted it, and kept reading his book. Everything was going as expected. That was the part that no one outside the human delegation quite understood. Yet none of this was improvised. It had been practiced, planned, and prepared for so long that by the time it finally happened, it felt to the people doing it almost like a routine. The most extraordinary morning in human history felt from the inside almost ordinary, which was in its own way the whole point. The morning after is always quieter than the night before. The supply convoys kept moving. The corridors stayed open. The Doroth did not come back. On the 3 independent worlds that had been going short of food and medicine, people began to receive what they needed, and their governments sent formal thank you messages to the Accord that were addressed specifically to the human delegation, which was something that had never happened before. On the Crossroads station, things looked the same as they always did on the surface. The corridors were busy. The food halls were open. The council anteroom had its usual small groups of delegates talking in low voices. But if you watched carefully, and Nadia Ortiz was always watching carefully, something had changed in the way people moved. The usual easy confidence of the Valari delegation was a little quieter. The Griot moved in smaller groups. Everyone was very polite to the humans. They passed more polite than before in the careful way that people are polite when they have realized they may have been impolite for a long time without knowing it. Claire noticed all of this. She did not comment on it. 3 days after the corridor operation, Elder Sarath called a full formal session of the council. Claire attended the way she always attended, on time in the outer ring, in her usual seat. Grant was on her left. Nadia was 2 seats behind. The chamber filled the same way it always filled, by order of seniority, with the Valari section settling last. Sarath opened the session. He moved through the formal acknowledgments and then stopped. He looked for a moment like a person choosing their words more carefully than usual. He thanked the human delegation on behalf of the full accord for the resolution of the Doroth situation. He used the formal register. Claire had been in the council chamber long enough to know that the formal register had 11 levels and that the one Sarath chose was reserved for recognized major powers. She had never heard it used for a human delegate before. She kept her face very still. The chamber was quiet for a moment after Sarath finished. It was the kind of quiet that has wait. Then Councillor Ashaton, the Greel delegate, asked Claire a direct question. She asked how many ships the human navy currently operated. Claire looked at her. She smiled the same smile she had been giving people in the chamber for 23 years, easy and warm and completely unrevealing. She said that she would be very happy to arrange a full briefing at their mutual convenience and that she thought it would be a productive conversation for everyone. Ashaton said she looked forward to it. The session continued. Claire voted in line with the Valari block on 2 of the 3 remaining items. On the 3rd, she abstained. It was the first time in 23 years that she had not voted with the block on anything. No one mentioned it out loud, but Nadia noted it, and she noted the way 7 different delegates looked at Claire after the abstention and the way none of them looked surprised, only thoughtful. The world was recalibrating. It would take time, and it would not be simple, but it had started. That evening, Grant Pelham sat at the small desk in his quarters and wrote a letter. He wrote it by hand on paper, which was a habit he had kept since he was a child. The letter was to his daughter, Casey, who was 12 and living in Portland with her mother. He and Casey's mother had been separated for 5 years, and Casey visited him on the crossroads during school breaks, and she had her mother's eyes and his habit of going very quiet when she was thinking hard about something. He did not explain in the letter what had happened. She would hear about it eventually, through the news, through school, through the way history has of finding its way into ordinary life. Instead, he told her about the color of the stars from the observation deck on a clear station night, which was a blue so deep it was almost not a color at all. He told her that he had spent a long time being patient about something, and that it had turned out to be worth it. He told her that being quiet was not the same as having nothing to say, and that she should never let anyone convince her otherwise. He signed it Dad, folded it, put it in an envelope, and set it by the door to mail in the morning. On the other side of the station, the anchor yards were now listed on the official Accord registry. There was no longer any reason to hide them. Crews were rotating through on normal schedules, running maintenance and system checks on ships that had been waiting a long time to be useful. The yards were busy in the ordinary way that workplaces are busy, with people doing their jobs and drinking bad coffee and talking about small things. One of those people was a young engineer named Ben Calloway, who was 23 and on his first real posting and still slightly amazed to be there. He was running checks on a mid-range vessel that had been sitting cold in an asteroid belt for 11 years. It was good work, careful and slow, the kind that requires a person to open panels and look inside and make sure everything is still the way it should be. In the fourth hour of his shift, he opened a maintenance panel in the lower deck corridor and found something that had not been in any system report. It was a small piece of paper, folded twice and taped to the inside of the panel housing. The tape had dried out and was barely holding. He peeled it off carefully and unfolded it. It was a handwritten note in a small, neat hand. It said, "I hope this thing ends up meaning something." There was no name, no date. Ben took a photo of it on his personal communicator and sent it to his supervisor with a short message saying he had found something interesting. His supervisor forwarded it up the chain. By the time it reached Grant Pelham, 3 forwarding messages had attached themselves to it, each one shorter than the last, as if the people sending it did not quite know what to say. Grant looked at the photo for a long time. Then he forwarded it to Claire with no message at all. Claire was in the observation bay when it came through, in her usual chair in the blue quiet of late station night. She looked at the photo. She read the note on the screen. She looked back out at the shipping lanes, which were clear, all of them in every direction, the lanes that ran through the corridors and out to the independent worlds and further, to places the Accord was only beginning to understand that humans knew very well. A human ship was running one of those lanes, its light steady and unhidden, moving at a normal pace with nothing to prove and nowhere to hide. It was, by any reasonable measure, perfectly ordinary sight. Claire put her communicator down. She sat with the silence for a while. Then she finished her drink, set the cup down carefully, and watched the stars.